Welcome to the DevLaunch podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories of the tech industry's rising stars, corporate America employees turned tech entrepreneurs. Hear how these folks took a risk in leaving their W-2 job to build their enterprise, the lessons they've learned along the way, and what they're doing to revolutionize this industry, one project at a time. Today, my guest and friend, Phil Ledgerwood, is the co-owner of Integrity Inspired Solutions, and he's our guest today. He runs a Kansas-based software development agency called Integrity Inspired Solutions, and they are on a mission to improve the lives of everyone who comes in contact with the software development process. Not only the people who want the software, but also the people who build it. Phil, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you very much, Tony. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Phil, you and I go way back. I mean,
way back,
way back.
So far back.
Maybe like a year ago or something like that.
Yeah, man, boy, how time has flown.
I know, I tell ya. Well, I just have to give a quick aside to the audience listening. I genuinely, after I got off my call, my first kind of networking call with Phil, I was like, this dude is legit. Because I still remember we were talking about a relatively mundane topic, namely pricing and pricing strategy.
Right.
And I'm like, man, there are a few people I feel like I could really enjoy this type of conversation with. And Phil, he's one of them.
Oh, well, thanks. I take that as very high praise.
Yes. Well, you are a breath of fresh air in many ways.
Thank you.
And I think one of the things that also struck me from our conversation, and anybody who knows Phil would probably attest to this as well, but you just have a teacher's heart. Like, I feel like that's just at the essence of what you do, like what you bring to the table and how you show up.
Yeah.
And I very much have appreciated that about you.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And, I think we're going to see this as we have our conversation today and kind of learn a little bit more about your story. But I think teaching is probably going to weave its way in here a little bit.
Probably. I like to tell people stuff. So yeah, right. that might happen. Yeah, I apologize in advance for explaining things to people that you already know who are watching the podcast.
It's perfect. I have a feeling like this will be the right audience for that kind of stuff.
Okay, cool.
So would you mind if we go all the way back, probably not to the very beginning of your career, but like about a little over a decade ago.
Okay.
So we're looking at, I don't know if that's like 11 or 12 years ago now when you guys first launched Integrity Inspired Solutions. That was 2012. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I was 5 years old. Yeah, I remember.
That's right.
Remember it very well.
You were just a young pup.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Back in the day. But your friend Travis, you guys got connected prior to this at Adventure Tech. Is that right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's right.
And so, 2012, you guys launched this. Like, can you tell us a little bit about what those early days were like? Was it like you were working another job to make ends meet and just sourcing contracts on the side, or like talk to us about what that was at the very beginning?
Sure. So our ramp into that was, like you said, Travis and I both at one time worked at the same company. That's how we met. When our arm of the company started to have some troubles, we had gotten together with a couple of other people who were in that same division, talked about starting our own company. But one of the things we found out real quick is that Travis and I had sort of a common vision. The other two people who are great, brilliant people who are still our colleagues to this day here in Kansas City, they kind of wanted a company that was a little bit different, a little bit more suited to them as individuals. So we never really took off. So I went to go work for a startup here in town that at the time was called NetChemia. It's not anymore. It was an excellent startup. I really enjoyed my time there. Carlos Santacara was the guy who headed that up. Brilliant guy. It was a great startup. Travis then became sort of like a private contractor, and he went to work with a client that he had developed a relationship with in the past. And so Integrity Inspired at first was really the name that Travis took on to do his own personal contract work. So I was employed full time still. He was doing contract work, but it was with a client relationship that we had from several years back.
Gotcha.
So about the time that circumstances opened up for me that I could do something with him, he's already kind of working in this way. So we just made an actual company out of it.
Hmm.
And then I came in under that umbrella working for the same client. And then between the two of us, we began to develop the business from there, expanding into new clients, bringing in more people. But the initial thing that started it kind of was that initial anchor client that Travis had been working for the whole time.
I got it. Got it. And so did this all happen in the period of that 2012, or was it like over the period of a couple of years you slowly transitioned in?
Is over a period of a couple of years,
Okay.
right? So he started in 2012. That's, if you go look at when the company was formed, that's the date that's on it.
Got
At
it.
the time, it was just him. And then we actually made a company out of it in 2014.
Got
Which is when I came on. And then shortly after that, we brought a third person on. About another year after that, we brought a fourth person on.
Hmm.
We did make a change in our business model that changed our growth rate considerably.
Hmm.
But in those early days, it was very much kind of a trickle. Finding that next client or making an existing client willing to bring another person on.
Hmm.
And we were all senior level developers.
Hmm.
And so hiring was slow for sure. We had definitely had a very narrow channel of people that we brought on. So
Interesting. But it sounds like as you grew, your priority was bringing other senior level type of developers into the mix. Is that right?
That's right. Because at the time, our business model was not just that we would develop your software, but we would go in and also coach you in improving your software development operations.
Oh,
So we were only working for clients that already had software development going on.
got it.
And then we would come alongside and then act as sort of like team leads or senior level devs. And we would not only build the software, but we would also change the software development operations to be more lean and more agile. So in order to have people who can do that, especially on their own, like they have to be senior level software developers. They got to be able to lead a team, and they got to be able to walk into a CEO's office and say, hey, I think the way we're going about operations here, I think our priorities are messed up, or we're not going to be able to hit the strategic goals with these strategies that you've laid out to hit and whatever. And the number of people who can do that, who are also local, pretty small, right? Some people are really awesome developers, and they just don't like working with management. It's just not where their heart is or their gifting is. And then some people, like, they really like talking to people and teaching and coaching and working at the organizational level, but maybe they can't lead a dev team, right? Or they can't code through very complicated problems. So we had to find people who could do both. And that model specifically kind of kept our growth down to a pretty low trickle the first couple of years. So we were very stable, but not really getting much bigger very fast.
I see. So you had referenced a change in your business model that kind of really ramped up your growth. Was that change in business model basically just a change away from that focus and into just more generally speaking software development?
Yeah. So we actually read a book called Joy Inc. That's INC, Joy Incorporated, written by Richard Sheridan. And he is one of the two owners at Menlo Innovations, which is a company that works very much like ours out in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And in this book, he writes about how he structured the company and the company's practices and everything like that in a way that he thought would maximize employee joy at work. And when I read the book, I was like, man, this is kind of what we've tried to do. We've kind of charted our own path through that. But these folks are doing exactly what we want to do. They're just maybe further along than we are. So we both flew out there to meet with Richard and spent the day with him and kind of learned how Menlo Innovations did things. And some of the things we thought maybe we had a leg up on, but some of the things just seemed really brilliant to us that we weren't doing or hadn't thought to do. And we adapted that. And so one of those big shifts was, instead of us going out to clients and trying to make them be the software company we always wanted to work at, we just decided to be that company.
Oh.
And so we pulled everybody in-house. We were no longer going to client sites on a regular basis. I mean, we still do for meetings and various things, but in terms of day-to-day work, we pulled everybody in, and we basically adopted the model of, you have software projects, we will give you another team to work on your software projects.
Hmm.
That way, if people wanted our coaching and transformation services, they could ask for that, but they didn't have to have that. And we could hire people who didn't have an interest in that. They were just good developers who had the same values that we did, but they might never meet with a project manager and talk to them about metrics or operations or how to structure user stories or things like that. And that made a big difference. That really enabled us to grow more quickly, because now we could bring in developers that had no interest in the consulting side.
Interesting. Yeah, it's like modify the value proposition a little bit so that it's a little bit broader. So then that way other people can get in on delivering that value. And then also your client base expands quite a bit, because I'd imagine the types of people who would be looking for what you grew into is probably a lot larger than what you originally started off at.
That's right. And I would say even our original clients, like they said they wanted our consulting and transformation work, but I don't know how much they meant that. I think they really liked our software development skills, and they really wanted that. But they weren't quite as crazy about us getting in there and trying to change things, trying to change the way they kind of did the software development activity and project management and funding and that sort of thing. They were a little less enthusiastic about that. So yeah, it really opened the doors. The other thing we found too is, I think we thought, and we started with this proposition, that there would be a lot of crossover between those two worlds, that people that we sort of coached operationally would be really interested in having a software development team that worked that way to kind of model it and build things for them. And vice versa. We thought that once people worked with us as software developers, they'd be like, wow, I wish my own teams worked that way. And they would want the coaching and consulting. And what we found is, generally speaking, it didn't really work that way. People either wanted one or the other, but usually not both, which I guess makes some sense, right? Like, when you go to McDonald's, you don't really want their opinions on how you should be cooking your hamburgers, right? Like, you just want their hamburgers. It would be weird if they started like trying to give you tips, And at the same time, if I went to like a culinary class on how to cook the world's best hamburger, I would be very surprised if they served us McDonald's for lunch, So
that's true. That's true. They're very, very different value propositions.
They are.
What you're providing in the coaching service versus what you're providing as a done-for-you service. So
that's right.
That's super interesting. Okay, so this is kind of coming out a little bit out of left field. I didn't prepare you for it.
Okay.
It's okay if you don't have these numbers ahead in your head, but I'm still remembering back to a conversation I had with one of my listeners, and he told me, he's like, Tony, I listen to all these podcasts, and they have great like rah advice, but nobody's talking about the numbers. So with all of this in mind, we're kind of charting your trajectory of growth. When you guys made that decision to kind of switch gears, modify your business model ever so slightly, do you happen to remember, like, where were you guys sitting at an annual revenue for the overall business before you made that switch?
We were making around about $1 million a year, from a revenue standpoint. And that was with about, between 4 to 6 people at any given time.
That's great.
And then when we made the switch, we doubled in size and pretty much doubled in revenue.
Yep.
For better or worse, at least today, our revenues are very closely related to the number of billable consultants that we have available. So you see one change, the other's going to change almost in a direct proportion.
Right. Which, I mean, getting back to the point that you were making before, when you modified your business model, like, that's the nature of this kind of new business model. It is largely going to be driven, and we're going to get into this too with like pricing, but it's largely going to be driven by the heads that you have. So that's so fascinating. You guys got to $1 million with that very boutique focus. That's incredible. Well done.
No, thanks.
So I guess like the follow-up question to that, and again, I didn't prep you for this,
Hmm.
but like, can you talk to us about the marketing efforts or the sales and marketing that the approach you guys took to get to that $1 million?
Hmm. Yeah, so there's kind of two components to it. One is, at least up to this point, a lot of our sales and marketing efforts ran along the relational channels we have in the community. So all of our developers are local. They're all here, and have been throughout our existence. That doesn't mean we won't ever do something different. I mean, the world is changing, the economic realities of the market are changing, and I don't know that we're always going to be able to do that. But at least today, up until this point, all of our developers have been right here. You can, if you're in the area, you can drive over and sit with your developers and hit them or throw things at them or whatever,
Hopefully
whatever,
not.
whatever the law allows. Um, and so a lot of our marketing and sales efforts flowed through these channels. Travis and I are both senior level developers that have worked in Kansas City for a long time, and in Kansas City it's sort of like that Kevin Bacon game, right? Except it's only 2 degrees instead of 6. Like, somebody has always worked with somebody you used to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And so developers that we knew would be at their companies, and they would run into issues, and they'd be like, hey, you know who would be really good at this? You should talk to Travis and Phil. And then we would end up in there. Or it would be other business owners we had met, or other directors of like CIOs, CTOs, directors of IT that we had met. And so that network really provided most of our business. We just had a really good reputation. I said had, like it's past tense, like we don't anymore. We have a really good reputation in the community, um, both in terms of our expertise, but also in terms of the consultative value
Mm.
that we bring to the table. We're kind of really known for not just building what you want, but actually helping you shape it,
Yeah.
giving you like strategic advice and things like, and technological advice on how to go about these different things. The other side of the coin is the whole reason Integrity got started was because of the dysfunction that we saw rampant in the activity of software development. And just like in your intro stated so aptly, we started to make life better for everyone involved in software development, not just the people who are going to be using it, but the people who are involved in its creation, which also involves clients, business analysts, QA folks, project managers, product owners, all different kinds of folks. We just saw that in the places we had worked time and time again be an unpleasant experience, a dehumanizing experience in a lot of ways, right? With a lot of broken trust, a lot of people working overtime, a lot of people being angry at each other and mistrustful of each other because not because the people were bad people, but because the system had sort of turned them against each other, right?
That's right.
So we had developed a lot of different ways, a lot of non-traditional ways to go about the activity of software development, from the technical level all the way up to project management. And these were very unique, especially at the time. As time goes on, they've become less unique because more and more companies are starting to do similar things. But at the time, especially, we were revolutionary. And so when we talked to a prospective client, right away, we got to know very quickly in the sales process, because we would figure out right away either they vibed with the way we did things, and if so, we were their best bet in town. And if they didn't, then no amount of work was going to make them like us, right? So I think having that very unique experiential offering was also a huge differentiator. We were either the only developers in town for some people, or they were never going to use us ever.
Yeah, right.
So,
Well,
yeah.
and I've got to imagine we're gonna be covering this as we talk a little bit about Agile, because that's a big foundational pillar of what you guys are doing.
Right.
And I mean, even down to the name of your podcast, the Agile Bites
Mhm.
podcast. I want to get into that in a minute, but I want to make sure to ask one question, which has to do with the launching of the company. So we'll put a pause on this for just a minute. Come
Okay.
back to why launch your own software development agency? Like, why not just get another good paying job? What was happening in your career at
Mhm.
that point, that juncture of pivot to starting it, that
Mhm.
helped you to realize the next right step for you was to become a business owner?
It's funny. I was just the guy who was repairing my drywall last week. We were talking about this because he's thinking of starting his own business too. And he
Mm.
wanted to know why I started my own.
Hmm.
And he said, was it because you wanted freedom? Was it because this, that, and the other thing? And I'm like, no, it wasn't it was not because I wanted to start my own business for various personal reasons and then thought about what business to start.
Mm.
It was very much driven by the mission. Um, Everywhere that I had, well, I shouldn't say everywhere, many of the places that I worked and that Travis had worked suffered from a lot of these dysfunctional things that we had seen that had very real effects on our quality of life and the quality of lives of the people around us. And everywhere we went, something about Travis and I is we always tried to make our environment look like where we wanted to work. Like no matter where we went, we always tried to change it. We always tried to change the world around us. And sometimes that went well, sometimes it didn't go so well. So it really wasn't about like, I want to start my own business and I know software, so it's a logical thing. It was really more, we both have this mission. We have
Mm.
this mission for the activity of software development to be different, for Kansas City to be a good place for software developers to work, for people to have very few hours of overtime, a lot of trust and collaboration and mutual respect within
Mm.
departments as opposed to tension and frustration with each
Mm.
other. And like, how are we going to get that done? Well, we had already both, worked 2 decades for other people and it had gotten as far as we could take it. So it's like, this is what we got to do, right? If we want the mission to continue, this is the next logical
Mm.
thing to do, is to create a business focused on it. And then once we kind of learn from that, to be like, well, we're just going to be the model. We're just going to be that company that we've always wanted everywhere we've worked to
Mm.
be. And I also think, you know, like I said earlier, obviously I'm in my early 20s. And I think I don't know why you're laughing at that. And I think when you get to a certain point in your career, it becomes less about uh, achievements and more about meaning,
Yes,
right? Like
that's
I
so
want
good.
to create meaning. I
Yep.
want to create a legacy. I want to feel like my efforts in my career have meant something bigger than myself.
Yeah. Hmm.
And you can absolutely do that as a full-time employee somewhere. I'm not trying to say you can't
Hmm.
by any stretch of the imagination. You can do that with whatever circumstances you
Hmm.
find yourself in, for sure. But for us, we had the means, we had the timing, and it just seemed like for the impact we really wanted to make, especially here in Kansas City, it was just the next logical way to do
Yeah.
that.
Oh, that is so good. I love hearing that the thing that was leading you in this again was not a I'm just in it for my own personal comfort. Although I'm sure that there are some elements of like, yeah, it would be kind of nice to be my own boss.
Oh, sure, sure.
But I
Hmm.
think the guiding light was this vision you had of the future you're
Hmm.
trying to create.
Exactly.
And it's, people do give Simon Sinek a little bit of grief. They're like, "Oh yeah, he's the rah-rah guy." But like there's truth to
Hmm.
start with why, right?
Sure.
And I think you
Hmm.
guys are your evidence of that and
Hmm.
how you can grow your company in the way that you have with that clarity of vision. I think
Hmm.
that's really compelling.
Yes. In fact, if I could tag on just a little bit
Yeah,
more to
please
that,
do.
one of the things we did, not right away, but especially as we began to change our business model and think about the future, is we actually went to a visioning seminar in Ann Arbor done by a company called Zing Train.
Hmm.
And they encouraged us to write our vision as a narrative, like
Ooh, I
like
like that.
almost write like a science fiction
Mm-hmm.
story where your company is 5 years in the future and just talk about like, what do you see, what do you
Mm-hmm.
hear, what's going on around you, so you write it as a lived out story.
Hmm.
And that really resonated for both Travis and I because, our vision does include revenue figures, it does include numbers and all the things that people put into their vision,
Hmm.
but it's a story of what you want life to look like,
Hmm.
which is not only exciting for us, but it's exciting to employees as well. Like they read the vision and they're like, man, future company sounds awesome. Like, I can't wait to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And we regularly with our employees review that vision, go back to it, talk about where we are on track, where we're not on track. Is our parts of the vision even still applicable?
Mm-hmm.
We, like, a global pandemic was not in our vision.
I mean,
So,
I would say very few
know,
people probably had that in their
right,
vision.
right. But I will say, like, approaching the whole vision issue as a narrative, as opposed to like a list of abstract propositions,
Hmm.
made a big difference, because it does make you think about your vision in terms of a lived out reality, as
Hmm.
opposed to just like a pie in the sky
Ooh,
aspiration or a
totally.
list of abstract principles or something
Well,
like
and
that.
if we're being honest, I think that's probably one of the main reasons why so few people, especially those that are of a more technical mindset, aspire to a very clear vision, is because it's
Hmm.
just like it feels so disconnected from reality.
Right,
But
right.
but taking that approach where you're writing a narrative, at least as a starting point, it's got to
Hmm.
be really helpful in
Hmm.
framing that vision.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
great. Okay, so I do want to now fast forward into the question that I was saying we'll pause on, we'll come
Hmm.
back to, but
Okay.
so you've got a YouTube channel, you've got a podcast,
Hmm.
and a lot of the content, if not all the content, is dedicated to Agile. And
Hmm.
I've been following you on LinkedIn for the better part of a year,
Hmm. Yes.
and
Thank
so
you for that, by the way.
of course, I always love. I will never forget. I think the very first post that I read of yours, it was I think it was like satire of some type. I feel like you write often in satire, but
Yeah.
anyway, I digress. But I can attest from all the content you have been putting out there that you are very much an avid proponent of
Hmm.
Agile on dev
Hmm.
teams. So can you talk to us a little bit about your journey with Agile, and why is it that you have so fully embraced this as part of your own professional identity and a foundational pillar for your business?
Sure. So, the whole Agile movement was kind of forged in the fires of dysfunction.
Hmm.
So, in some ways, like my spiritual predecessors, that's where the Agile Manifesto came out of, right? It's like the sort of old, like, we build software the way like Henry Ford built cars, or the way a big construction firm builds houses, where it's like we can do all this upfront planning, we can know everything up front, we can create these deadlines 2 years, 3 years out, and we can pretend like those are realistic, and then we do all the requirements, and then we do all the design, and like all this stuff. Like, everybody knew this was terrible, but people didn't have a really good grasp on how to do something different. XP, the extreme programming movement, was one of the most prolific. I'm not necessarily sure they were the first. They may have been the first, but one of the most prolific movements to try to shake this up. And they were just doing crazy stuff at the time. Um, much of which became foundational for agile practices that you see today. But the point is they were just like, man, can we just do something, anything different than this? Can we just try experiments that get us out of our comfort zone and see if that works better? And that spirit is something that resonates a lot with me, right? And
Hmm.
my introduction to the formal agile movement was becoming a certified Scrum Master, back in 1778. And it was part of a big corporate thing.
Yeah.
And I sat in a room for 2 days, and that was the prerequisite for my certification. Like,
Hmm.
there was no exam, there was no nothing. It's like, you
Oh.
sat here for 2 days, you're still breathing, you are now a Scrum
Oh,
Master.
wow.
And I didn't really understand like what the practices were trying to accomplish.
Hmm.
And I don't think the person teaching me did either. So we sort of had this collection of practices in our heads, and we tried to do them, we did them badly. And because we never really knew what we were trying to do with them in the first place, we didn't really change them in healthy ways.
Hmm.
And most of it, we just kind of went back to what we were doing before,
Hmm.
or we just kept doing it as a formality or whatever. I think a lot of organizations to this day are still kind of in that spot. But I personally kind of went on a mission like, all right, I know what we're trying to get to. Learning a cookbook of practices is not going to make this magically happen. I really need to dig into the whys, the principles. I really need to become more framework agnostic. Think about the goals and outcomes I want to see, and what's going to get me there. And so, started getting into Kanban and later Tameflow and some of these other ways of thinking about lean and agility, and just working to find things that worked for integrity and then being able to share that with other people. So it was really more of an outcome driven approach rather than a framework driven approach. All of our practices, some of our practices, like you just won't find in Scrum or you won't find in Kanban, because the practices came out of goals and a context.
Got it.
Right. And working with so many different organizations, this is why I love coaching, is because every organization is different. You can't just come in with your list of, okay, start doing this stuff. And my job as a coach is to make you good at doing this list of stuff. Because some of those things are just not going to work there. Right. They're just not going to fit. Right. You have to be conversant with outcomes and principles and be able to customize and tweak and select for what's going to work for you. And this is true for every organization. Right. So it's a big part of what we do, because having sort of forged these practices, they've given us a way of working with our clients that has traditionally been pretty unique, and makes for a very interesting addition to our value proposition. And there's all kinds of things we could talk about. I could really dominate the rest of the podcast just talking about that. But just to throw out one example, which I think is a big deal. So a lot of times the way agile projects or any software project really is sort of estimated and funded is you sort of get an idea of what all the requirements are. You get people to look at this. Usually, in the worst case, it's usually a salesperson, but in the best case, it's usually a number of people, including software engineers. And you're like, how long do you think this is going to take? How long do you think that's going to take? And you're doing all this guessing, and you come up with the time frame, and that becomes the time frame. And then you fund that time frame. What's the cost associated with that time frame? And now you're off to the races. Well, the problem that this can create is everything has been keyed to this notion that we know what we're going to build, so we have a pretty decent idea of how long it's going to take. Therefore, we have a pretty decent idea of how to price it using that pricing model. I know you wouldn't use that pricing model, but for the sake of argument, this is usually how it goes, right? Well, there's a number of problems with that. Right out of the gates, we don't know what we're going to build in a lot of enterprise level projects. Sometimes you do. And when you do, an agile approach is not necessarily something you need. But for those complex enterprise level pieces of software where you're going to need to learn from the business as it evolves, or as their own understanding of their business evolves, or as the market changes, or as legislation changes or whatever, you just don't, especially like a 2-year, 3-year, what are you doing, man? Like, you have no idea. Like, I have trouble planning tomorrow, much less 3 years, right? So those estimates are always off, which means the budgets are always off, which means you have to put structures around that. You have to have like a change management process, and you have to decide what's in scope and what's out of scope. And already we're setting ourselves up for a litigious relationship, right? Because now the client says, oh, now that I've seen that feature, I realize I also need X, Y, and Z. And you're like, well, it's out of scope. Or, well, we'd have to rewrite all this stuff in order to accommodate that, right? Or now we're going to have to move the Gantt chart around and change the final price or whatever, or eat it, right? As a development company or whatever. Like, nobody wins in that scenario. Well, what we do is we start developing your first few features. We measure the throughput of those features, and we run simulations of the project's future. We run 10,000 of them at a time, and we show you the probabilistic trends of the possible future outcomes of the project. And we just do this every week, every 2 weeks. We are always giving you a new weather forecast for the project. So I know that we're going to miss a deadline 9 months in advance. And we can have that conversation 9 months in advance and talk about what we want to do. Do we want to change scope? Do we want to add people? Do we just want to decide, hey, these are nice bonus features if we have time? Do we want to divide it up into phases? But now we're having that conversation 9 months in advance,
Yeah.
not 3 weeks before the
That's
deadline,
so
which is
good.
when most people have that
That's
conversation,
right.
right?
Yep.
And so these probabilistic forecasts
Hmm.
have been a real unique. I've taught many of our competitors how to do it. It's just, to my knowledge, we're the only people that do it. But it's become so popular, right? Because we all know we can't say for sure what's going to happen with deadlines, but I can give you a weather forecast. Weather forecasters don't tell you if it's going to rain, they give you a percent chance.
Likelihoods, yeah.
And that's what I do.
That's right.
Here's the percent likelihood we're going to finish by this date. Here's the percent likelihood we're going to finish by this date. Here's the percent likelihood we're going to finish by this date. And every week or two, I'm going to give you an updated forecast. So we can look at the numbers, we can look at the risk, and we can reevaluate our decisions way before that projected timeline gets here. It's just a very powerful thing. And that's just one thing.
Yeah.
There's a whole suite of unique things like that we bring to the table.
So is this thing you were telling me, is this the Monte Carlo simulation you were talking about? Okay.
Yep.
I'm like, man, the inner nerd inside of me is like, oh yeah, I know Monte Carlo simulations. I love them.
Yes. It's actually super easy. But in order to have a workflow that you can project using those simulations, you have to be very lean and agile in how you approach your workflow. There's other changes that you have to make. And I think a lot of places are just like, we just don't want to do that.
Yep.
We just don't want to make those changes.
Yeah. And so this actually flows very nicely into the next question, which is, I'm just thinking, I'm recalling back to my days in corporate America. And I remember being on the business side, right? So working with software developers, but being on the, the one who's giving the requirements, the one who's talking about the needs of the tools. And I just always remember things in my paradigm was everything's framed in waterfall terms. I mean, especially in the finance and accounting world, everything is a waterfall method because, at these publicly traded companies, you've got, your 10Qs and your 10Ks, and you've got calendars that you can figure out, years in advance when you're going to have filing deadlines, all this kind of stuff. So it wasn't until I got to know the tech teams that were actually building out some of these tools for me that I ever noticed that there was a disconnect between software development and how they run and how we run in the business. And so the thing I'm really curious to get your insight into, your perspective on, is like, has Agile ever been a hindrance for you and your team as you work with your clients? And if not, how do you make Agile a win-win for both you and the suits?
Right. So a big part of our sales cycle is education, which is why I'm so well suited for it, I guess, because I love that. I really enjoy doing that. Cost-based accounting is, I call it like, if you remember, because I'm a nerd, so you remember the Lord of the Rings, and like Aragorn's army, they march, and then they get to the gates, right? And the mouth of Sauron comes out and talks to them, and it's like the last fortress that they have to overcome. And to me, accounting is that. And the mouth of Sauron comes out and says, we must have a fixed basis for providing what is the ROI of the software project, like dictating all these dark magical words to make the project fail.
Oh my gosh.
So, businesses are used to thinking of their cash spend in terms of the balance sheet, right? It's like, here's my expense, here's my profit, and the difference is the ROI, right? And so like when they think of software, they're like, I want to buy this thing, this item, and the use of this item is going to make me some money. Does this equation bear out? What they're not as used to thinking about is streaming funding into something and getting an equivalent stream of value back. As consumers, we're very used to this, right? I give Netflix $15 a month, and here's the value I get out of Netflix every month. It's not that Netflix they don't offer me like a block of 50 movies. Like, it's an ongoing stream of value that I am funding with an ongoing stream of funding, right? And so when we're talking with clients and they're like, all right, let me give you a list of 500 requirements and you tell me how much this is going to cost. It's like, well, this list that you think you've got is not going to be the list. Like, I know you think it is, but once you start seeing things, This isn't going to be the list. New things will become important to you. Some of the things on this list will not be important to you anymore. And even if that were the case, the market's going to change, your business is going to change. Even sometimes the regulations around the software we build change mid-flight. So you have to have the flexibility to be able to shift. Now, some projects are more well-known than others. That's true. Now, I'm not saying every project is a fly by the seat of your pants. Every week we're figuring out what the product is. That's rarely the case. But that's always a big element to it. And so if you at the beginning of a project, you go, okay, this is the size and this is the cost and this is the projected profit, that's the time you know the least about what's actually going to happen. That's the time when you're the most ignorant about what the actual software is going to be and how it's going to end up. And everyone plans around that. And they're very reluctant to move off of it. And they get very upset when you do, right? Like, hey, it turns out this is going to be an extra $60,000. Well, nobody wants to hear that, right? But that's the reality of it. And we all know, but we all keep pretending that we can do like a cost-based analysis of a software project. So what we tell our clients is, yeah, if you want, we can give you a nice scoped out statement of work. We can attach a price to that. And then when the project ends up looking very different than this, we're going to have a choice to make. We can either keep going down this road that we've defined that we now know is wrong and build that, or we'll have to renegotiate these terms. And that is usually an unpleasant conversation for both parties, right? And we have to figure out what that structure looks like. And then it's like, oh, well, you missed this requirement. Oh, no, you never said it. Oh, well, that's a new feature. No, that's a bug. That's not a feature. And now you're in this very contentious relationship and money is involved. And a lot of people get sick of their software developer agencies for this specific reason, right? So I have to educate them like it's in your best interest to think about this project as a stream of value that you fund in a stream as opposed to a fixed item that you pay a fixed price for and get some kind of fixed return on. You know, you have to look at the value that you're getting for the funding that you're putting in, and are these metrics going in the right direction? If so, you keep adding money to it. If not, then you stop. Right. And so it is an obstacle because people are very used to thinking in the cost-based accounting world. And sometimes, you know, when we're like, I'm not going to give you a fixed bid, then they're like, well, then you're not getting the contract. And it's always regrettable when that happens. It's always regrettable when we can't cross that chasm. But the thing is, if that's just not the way they're structured to go about projects, then this will not be the first time we have an issue.
That's true.
You know, and so that's why client selection is just as important to us as everything else. We turn away far more projects than we take because we really need to be in alignment on that principle. What does software development actually look like? What are you going to get in return? And how do we fund that? And making sure you understand it's in your best interest, because this is what enables us to pivot in response to these different forces, including your own desires. Whereas if we lock you into a form that we hold on to for 2 years, it's just going to be wrong coming out the other side. And you will have paid a ton of money for something that you don't want.
Yeah, man. There's many nuggets to take from what you just said. But one of the big ones I'm hearing is this process of being able to properly implement Agile when working with teams who invariably will eventually get to a place of thinking in the paradigm of waterfall is there must be education.
Absolutely.
You must be an educator. If you don't educate your clients or your prospects, that's where the rub is going to start, is just a lack of understanding, lack of education. The second thing I heard you say is a reframe away from a one-time investment or kind of like an individual thing where you can very concretely calculate on the front end the ROI, and reframing that to be like you said, like a stream of value. So kind of likening it to Netflix, where it's like I'm paying in a little bit every month and I'm getting value every single month. That was really, really good. And kind of thirdly, one of my big takeaways was even like the sales process can be a great way of you ensuring that you are only really working with the types of clients that you know your style of work is going to be successful, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you want to vet that out. If they're committed to like, no, we need to know exactly the dollar amount, then
Mm-hmm.
they're probably never going to think in the terms that you need them to think in for this to be a successful engagement.
That's right. That's right. And not every project needs an agile approach. Okay. I mean, that's the thing. I'm not trying to say like all software companies or software teams should aspire to do what we do. That's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Some software in some domains just doesn't benefit a lot from that flexibility.
Right.
But we find that at the level of like corporate application development, that situation is more common than not.
Yes.
And we really are only showing love to our clients by helping them reframe the way they think about the software project. We're not caring about them if we try to take reality and try to dress it up to look like what they're used to.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes even with developers that we bring on, there's an educational restructuring here as well, because a lot of agile teams that are out there are only maybe formalistically agile and haven't really internalized like what the agile movement is trying to get them to do. They've adopted a framework, but they haven't really been intrinsically transformed by that way of looking at business and value delivery.
That's good. Well, I figured we would probably run out of time because I always have like, these are always such great conversations. I do have more questions, but in the interest of time, I say let's work towards wrapping it up. And then Phil, I'm just gonna have to have you on again because
I guess so.
I gotta tap your brain on so many more topics.
Yeah.
But no, this has been wonderful. So I think something that would be really great. I love to give an opportunity for each of my guests to speak to a very particular audience, and namely the two audiences that are mostly going to be listening to this are, number one, those that are in corporate America right now, probably software developers, likely senior software devs, so people who are highly skilled or they're working their way up towards getting more and more technical knowledge. And also people who maybe just recently launched their software development agency. I'd love it if you could, for a moment, speak to these people. It's like you're speaking to a younger version of yourself. Okay. And just give them some words
don't get
wisdom.
married.
Yeah. Oh, there you go.
No, I'm just kidding.
Give them some words of wisdom, whatever those words of wisdom might be. Just land it on us.
Sure. I would say that if you are thinking about starting your own sort of software development agency, or you have recently started your development agency, something that I think is really important is to determine your reason to exist in an ecosystem that already has many software development agencies in it. Why should somebody work with you as opposed to the 8 zillion other options that they have, or use an offshore team? Or if you're offshore, why should they use you instead of using an onshore team or a nearshore team? To really think about why you as a firm need to exist. Because in the current market, in the current economy, we're all over the place. And we even have competitors that have gotten out of the game because you really need to have that differentiator, like whether it's an industry you specialize in, or a specific technology or specific capability that you specialize in. For us, it's the experience. It's the experience of working in the way that we work with you. It might be a specific area of technical expertise, like we really do Azure Cloud or something like that. But you need to be able to answer the question, why should I use you as opposed to all my other options? Find the answer to that question. It's not going to be good enough to just be like, well, I like software development and I'm good at it. Everyone is going to say that. What can you say about you and your firm that your competitors will have a hard time honestly saying? And really make sure that's a prominent part of your messaging and your identity.
Make sure you know your USP, your unique selling point. And I mean, even just that word of wisdom bears true, Phil, in your own experience with Integrity Inspired Solutions. Like you said, you guys have a very unique way of doing the software development life cycle. And that's been one of your USPs that's clearly been very successful. So I love that piece of advice. Know your USP. Especially for the technical folks that are out there, one of the things we're going to be needing to work on rounding out in you is not more technical skills, but rather more of these business skills. Get you a little bit more of a well-rounded individual to be successful in this space. Phil, where can people go to see, to follow you, to get in contact with you? If they have questions, where would they go to reach out?
Sure. So my company's name is Integrity Inspired Solutions, and our website is integrityinspired.com. And we have contact information and a form there. That's one way to get in touch with me. My email address is phil@integrityinspired.com. I'm also very active on LinkedIn. So if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, when you send me an invite, just leave me a note that you saw me on this podcast so I know who you are and how you found me, and we can connect there. You can follow my content there. Also, Tony has mentioned a few times now the Agile Bites podcast, which we drop every Monday, except for one. And you can find that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, wherever great podcasts are sold. You can find that podcast. And we also have, Integrity Inspired also has a YouTube channel that you can take a look at, which is mostly clips from the podcast. So if you're already listening to the podcast, the YouTube it has a few extra things on there, but probably not too much more than that. And those would probably be the best ways to kind of see what we're doing.
That's great. Well, for the one that was missed, Phil did issue a public apology.
I did. It was very heartfelt. Yeah,
it was. It
was rough.
A couple tears came. That was
rough.
It was great. But Phil, thank you so much for being on the show. I've greatly appreciated your fresh perspectives, especially on Agile, and also just how you've been building your agency. This has been great.
Well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. All right. And thank you all to our listeners. If you've found value in our podcast today, please share it with your friends and make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And also don't forget to leave us a review because it helps other people to find us and hear inspiring stories just like the one you heard today. If you are the founder of a software development agency or you know somebody who is, and you'd like to share something exciting that you're up to with our audience, drop me a line at tony@equip.com. That's ACCQUIP.com.